Hello everyone, this is Darcinovia here. This is my review on Spock Must Die, one of the first Star Trek novels ever published. This novel was published in 1970, so this novel is like over 50 years old. And there's, an interesting thing about this. There was barely anything original when it came to Star Trek novels back then. Most of it was novelizations of original series episodes and episodes of the animated series. This was one of the first, not the first original stories when it came to novels. And Spock Must Die, written by James Brush, who wrote the novelizations of every original series episode with the exception of one of them. And how does this story hold up, 51 years later? Because this is, a pretty old book. And the oldest, Star Trek novel that I own. But the edition that I own, is not a first edition. The edition I own is a I'm just gonna look it up. They're a 14th printing. This is the 14th printing that I own physically. Of course, if you are when you're watching this, I am using a cover that was used for the reprint. In the 1990s, this novel was reprinted. This novel is not that difficult to find, now. It's very relatively cheap. Though I haven't really talked about the story at this point. The story of Spock Must Die is essentially this, Spock, gets, replicated, when, when something goes wrong with the transporter, and there's two Spocks. Now, in order to make things simple for the reader, since this is, a different medium than television, the author, called Spock, the one that we know from the show, Spock 2, and the replica, Spock 1. Yeah, shocking. And I will say this, even though this book is kind of predictable on who Spock, was, at least the replica, and it was revealed to be Spock 1. It's like, okay, this isn't a surprise, because there's a lot of hints that Spock 1, is the replica and not Spock 2. This book, even though it doesn't really fit in the modern Star Trek literary verse, I still think it's an enjoyable read, considering, if you want to read about, what authors did in the early days of Star Trek before, the literary verse was as established as it was today. This was basically one of the first books published that wasn't a novelization. And for one of the first original stories, I think it's pretty, good for the most part. Sure, it's dated because some of the scientific terms are used in this book and the technobabble, and how there's certain things that just doesn't mesh well, especially if you are familiar with the more modern iterations of Star Trek. But if you're interested in reading, a piece of history and you're just curious about what old novels of Star Trek were like in the early 1970s, I'd give this a shot. It isn't hard to find. Spock Must Die, I give this a good rating. It's a good time, and I don't think you'll regret it, especially if you're a fan of the original series. Next time I review a Star Trek novel, I will surprise you what I'm going to review. Later, and may we live long and prosper.